Hi everybody. This is our Northern Rivers Plasma meeting, September 2022. I'd like to welcome you all here. And before we start our meeting, I'd just like to announce that we've just heard that our very, very special friend Neil, who was instrumental in our Northern Rivers Plasma group, has just passed away. The loss is very, very sad for all of us. He was a dear friend, and he's been on a very long journey with us. And I would just like for us to send anything he needs to elevate his soul for his next journey. It's not the end, it's just the beginning. And so we'll have a minute's silence for Neil before we have our teaching. We love you, Neil. And I'll hand you over to Jimmy now.
Can I just say, as far as Neil goes, he wasn't just a member of our little group, but he did a lot of work. Many may not know, but he did a lot of work worldwide, establishing all sorts of parameters for making television details. And I think there'll probably be an announcement in the next Knowledge Seekers workshop. I'd be surprised if there wasn't. And, you know, he did a lot of service and much appreciated by people in many places who work with video, because let's remember, nobody knew anything until Neil popped up and gave invaluable advice. You know, that's been more developed now by people, but he was, as Jim would say, the seed that started the ball rolling. So I just wanted to say that I elevate his soul on his journey.
Thank you, Doug. Does anybody else want to say anything before we start? We'll begin. All right. Today's workshop is looking at a bit in the past. It seems with what Mr. Kesh is teaching us in the last while, going back to the GANS seems like a lifetime away. But in terms of the progress and understanding that all of us have made, but I think it is important just to go back and refresh on a lot of the basics. There are a lot of new people out there, and so, you know, gives everybody an opportunity just to relook and refresh on what we understand about the GANS. So we understand that a GANS, or commonly also known as the plasma, is made up of millions and millions of fields, magnetic fields, that come together and interact to create the plasma and the toroid effect of the fields. And that gives us our dynamic field interaction. So that's essentially what a single GANS is. It's like it's like the sun, which is constantly giving off and receiving fields from its environment. So if you just visualize each and every little GANS that you produce is just like the sun. The technical definition of the GANS is a new state of matter, a gas which becomes a nano and appears as a solid state of matter. So that's where we get the acronym of GANS from. So it's a gas which is a nano and appears as a solid. The very first and the sort of one of the most important GANSs that we can produce is the CO2 GANS. So I'll go through that in detail again, and then we'll touch on the other GANSs which came from the production of the CO2. So essentially what we need to create the CO2 GANS is a zinc plate, a nano-coated copper plate, plastic box, an LED light, some copper wire, your distilled water or filtered water, and pure salt, sodium chloride. And that gives you your basics to set up and begin your CO2 production. Now, what we often relate to the production of the CO2 is essentially the structure of a leaf. So all we're doing is mimicking nature in a sense. So because often when you look at a leaf, any leaf from tree, plant, you'll see that the surface of that leaf has two sides. There's always the front side, top side, which is always your shiny, has a real shiny look to it, and then the underside is the matte, is a sort of a matte finish. So the leaf in between those two layers creates the condition to attract the fields of carbon in between the two layers, and thereby creating the CO2 within the leaf. So all we're doing is copying nature. So we have our nano-layered copper plate, which represents the top surface of the leaf, that shiny part. And then our zinc plate is the other surface of the leaf. And between the two of them, we then in our box create the same condition to attract the fields of the carbon. Just important to remember is when you have created your nano-layered copper plate, is to always wash them carefully to remove any of the any residual effects of the caustic soda process, because you don't want this to build up into your CO2 GANS that you produce. We won't go into any of the details on how you produce the nano layers, but there's a lot of information on different websites. The KPSSI has some information there on how to produce your nano, and I think on Plasma in Nature, the blog, there are certain blog articles there which also go through the details on how to create your nano layers. So as we said, the two plates are representing the two sides of a leaf, and we have that gap in between. Essentially what we're doing is we're creating a magnetical gravitational condition around our two plates. So which is equal to the field strength of sort of the carbon and CO2 in the environment. So that's what the leaf does in nature, and all we're doing is then we'll mimic that and in our CO2 box. So when you look at the your size container, it all comes down to your size plates that you want to use. It can be done in quite a big box if you've got large plates to produce quite a large amount of GANS material, or you can do it in a little cup, little glass, as we're done on the some of the 1 cup 1 life GANSes. So it depends on what materials you have. You can create the different size boxes and your copper plates and your zinc plates. So you just place your plates within the box, get to another drawing correctly. And the whole idea is we have to connect the 2 plates together to create the flow of the fields from one to the other. Just like the leaf within the also creates that connection between the 2 surfaces. But we have to, with that, when we connect the 2 plates together, we need to put an LED in between, because this breaks or slows down the current flow between the 2. Because we've got our plates in the salt water, it would set up quite a high current flow between the 2. So the LED basically creates a resistance between the 2 plates, so that we're slowing down that flow of energy between the 2 plates. So you'll see that the LED, I know Mr. Kesh has recommended either the red or the green one, and the shorter end of the LED, which is your negative, is then connected to the nano side plate, and the positive side is connected to the zinc plate. You then have your box can be filled in with distilled water mixed with your sodium chloride, and you can use seawater, or you can create a mixture of salts. So you can have sodium chloride in there, you can have magnesium chloride, so you can have your different salts which would sort of tune into different parts of your body. So once we learn more about the creation of the CO2 and how we want to connect very specifically to different organs of the body, we will then make the salt solution in sort of a similar salt composition with whatever body part we'd like to target. So that's still a lot of information which researchers will have to study years down the line. But for us, the basics, we can just use sodium chloride. And if you can't get the pure stuff, then say you can get the sea salt, the crystals from any of the local shops. And that's pretty good to use as well. The percentage salt can be around 3 to 4%. Often I'm using around 8% as well. Your seawater has a salt composition, I think it's around 5 or 6, depending on where you are around the world. So again, you can vary that composition of the salt, and you'll find that you'll get different results in terms of the GANS that it's produced. As I say, I find pretty good results at around the 8% salt solution. So what we're essentially doing between our 2 plates is, when you look at the nanocopper plate, and because that is a nanostructure, the field effect, the magnetic gravitational field effect from the nanostructure extends quite far from the actual surface of that plate and covers that whole area between your nanoplate and your zinc plate. And what it does is it creates that plasmatic environment And it also creates, between the two plates, you get creates the condition to attract carbon. So essentially what we're doing is we are creating a magnet between the two plates to attract the fields of carbon from the environment. So just like we can play with our normal iron-based magnets, and we know one magnet will attract the other magnet because there's a common denominator between the two. So we understand with the carbon as well, we create the right sort of magnetic effect, field effect for the carbon within our two plates, and this will pull in the carbon from the environment. When the carbon comes, what happens is the carbon gets pulled in, and in a way it gets pulled in between the nanostructures of the plates of your nanolayered copper plate. And as those fields build up, then they are sort of expelled from that plate, and then they interact with the oxygen in the water, thereby creating the CO2, which then settles at the bottom as a white creamy sediment. If anybody's got any questions as I'm going through, just speak up and then we can answer any questions as we go through. So having the LED in place, because we're slowing down the fields, we're creating that environment to pull in more of the carbon from the environment and to create the CO2. And in this condition, we create around about 85% CO2 and around 15% of zinc oxide. The minute we take away that LED between the two plates, we then are essentially almost creating the opposite, almost 80–90% zinc oxide and about 10% CO2. So once you set up your box, it requires patience. You set up your box and you put it. The best place to put it is near a window which gets quite a bit of sun, because you're wanting to put it in a position where the fields from the environment and the sun can easily come and interact with your box. You can put it outside as well. We've got ours on sort of a shaded covered deck area. If you set them up in a basement, you'll find that you will still produce the CO2, but not as much as if you allowed them more exposure to the light and the environment around. So it's always best to create a nice, perfect spot. We've played around, and some places in the house you'll produce huge amounts of CO2, and you move your boxes to another area of the house, and all of a sudden you're not producing, because it just depends on that position and where it can interact with the fields. So once you've set your box up, the box can run for days, weeks, and sometimes months. And you'll see after a few days, your tiny, fine little flakes will settle on the bottom of your box, and these will then build over time. When we look at the technical side of why Mr. Kesh has chosen specifically the copper plate and the zinc plate to create that same environment as the leaf, we have to look at the sort of atomic mass of the different metals. So when you look at zinc, the atomic mass is 65, and when you look at copper, it's 63. However, when you do nano-coat any material, because of the nature of the atoms being further apart within that metal structure on the surface, the atomic mass is about less than 5% less than what it would be. And so you're looking at then that difference of that nanocopper would have then the atomic mass of around 59. So when you look at that difference between 59 and zinc, which is 65, that gives you 6. Now, so we have essentially then created that gravitational field strength difference of carbon, which was 6 neutrons. Now, so it's been the 6 carbon itself has 6 neutrons, 6 protons, and 6 electrons, but the neutrons form the greater mass of between the neutrons, protons, and electrons. So essentially, what we need is just more than 50%, which is your 6 neutrons, to attract the actual carbon. So the 2 different plates creates that condition of creating that magnet to attract the fields of carbon. When you play around with different metals, different plates, different metals, then you will create different gravitational conditions to create different fields from the environment and pulling in to create your different GANS materials. So once your CO2 box has been set up and running for a few weeks, you will see that fine sediment on the bottom. I equate it to sort of GANS farming, because you can't just set up the box and leave it. You know, one needs to sort of tend it and see what's going on. And also every couple of days you can come and then with the syringe, you can just siphon up all the CO2 GANS material on the bottom of the box, and then just place that into a separate container. And you do this every few days and week after week. So it's essentially you tending your fields of carbon and collecting your GANS materials. And once you've pulled out, you know, when you're pulling out some of the GANS materials, your water level does drop. You can just top up that water level again with that same composition of salt solution. So it's a continual process that you just get into the habits of, you know, coming every couple of days and collecting the GANS material that's formed. Then the washing of the GANS. So obviously your GANS that you have collected will be still full of the salt. So one has to then start washing your GANS, washing the salt from the GANS. This is very easy to be done. Is if you've got, say, a liter bottle and you might have collected 50 mils of GANS at the bottom, all that you do is you just fill that bottle up with water, clean water, and allow it to settle. So after about 12 hours, all that GANS material then settles to the bottom. You then slowly pour off the top water, and then just add fresh water all the time and allow it to settle and pour it off. So if you do this about 5-6 times, you will get rid of 95-96% of that salt from your GANS material. And then all I do is just do a taste test. So after you've done it a few times, you just taste with your mouth, with test the water, and to see whether you taste any water in that any salt in the water, and then you know that your GANS is sort of pretty well washed. It's not the most scientific test, but it's it works very well when producing your GANS. The other important thing to remember is especially your first and second water that you pour off as your wash water. This must be kept in a separate container, because it can be used on many uses down the line, because that salt water has all the fields of the CO2 GANS within it. And so keeping that as a wash water, you know, put in a separate container and label it, and you know exactly what it is, because in many other uses down the line, especially like in the antibiotic formulation that Kesh brought out with the COVID. It was the cup of life number 2, for example. You take that water and you're mixing 10% of your cup number 1 or even CO2 wash water, and that creates a very effective antibiotic. So there's many uses for your washed salt water. So always keep, especially those first 2 washes, in a separate container, and they will come in handy for many, many uses down the line. So everything that we use, has its use. We don't just throw away that salt water. The other important part of the CO2, producing the CO2, is just as we've noticed on the top surface of the leaf, it's always very shiny, and that shiny is essentially the amino acids which form on the surface of your container of the water. Now, what happens is in your CO2 production, the carbon is pulled in and forms the CO2 GANS material within the water solution. Also, what happens is, because you're pulling in the carbon, one is also pulling in the nitrogen and hydrogen from the environment. And so what happens over time is you will see that on the surface of your water, you will form you'll see an oily substance forming, and that is essentially the amino acids, because the basics of the amino acids is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And we have all those in that environment around the CO2 box. So again, all that you do is just take a plastic spoon, and one can just scoop off that water as that amino acid is forming, and just scoop it off and keep that in a separate container with the salt water, so that amino acid is not washed, and keep that in a separate container, because that can be added then back to some of your GANSs that have been washed, and depending on the use, can be used at a later stage. So again, the CO2 amino acid is almost more important than the actual CO2 GANS that you produce, because it has so much more of a connection to our body, because it's one amino acid to another. And the same with when you're using it in agriculture and plants, the amino acid you produce has a much closer connection to your plants that you are working with. So now in this picture, we show the copper GANS, but what we're trying to just highlight here is that the water on top of the GANS. So once you've washed your GANS, then you can store it in any glass jar, preferably glass over plastic, because the GANS interacts with plastic, and we find over time that your plastic degrades because of the GANS material. So it's best to store it in a glass container. And you fill up your glass container with your GANS, and it all fluffs up, and then after about 12 hours it all settles down to the bottom. Now, the water off the top of your GANS, that 2/3 of the water, is what we commonly use for different applications. One can, especially in the CO2, you can drink that water. So it's not the GANS material at the bottom, but just the water, the 2/3 of the water which sits above. So one can take that water off, use it, and then you're just topping the water back up again and allowing the GANS material to sit. So once you've created that small amount of CO2 GANS and you're just using the water off it, you can use huge amounts of the water of it without actually losing any of your GANS material at the bottom. Okay, so that's the CO2 production. Now, the other important GANS, and we'll go into more detail later in terms of the uses of the GANS. But the zinc GANS is exactly the same setup as your CO2, except because we have the zinc plate and the nanocopper plate, except in this time, we do not have the LED between the two. So we have a straight wire connection between the two plates. And because of the higher flow between the two plates, we then essentially are going to be producing 90–95% zinc oxide and 5 to 10% CO2 GANS. So it's the same setup, just without the LED. Any questions before we go on? Okay. The other important one is your copper GANS. In this case, we have, again, your nanocopper plate and a plain copper plate. And you connect the two plates with the wire. There's no LED in this one either. And in this process, you're then creating your copper oxide GANS. There's the zinc GANS. As we said, it's just the two plates. Oh, this is the other one. The other way to produce the zinc GANS is you can have two zinc plates. So the one can be a nano zinc plate that you can nano coat, and the other one can be your plain zinc plate. And in this case, you're also going to be producing your zinc GANS. This method you then are ensured that you're going to be producing, 100% zinc GANS, whereas with the other method using the nano-coated copper plate, you are going to be producing some percentage of CO2 GANS in there. So it, again, just depends on your particular application and what you want to create using different plates and different methods. Okay, so I think I did not have the CH3 in there. Okay, must have missed that one. Right, the CH3 GANS is same box setup, but what we do have is we have our nano copper plate, and we then have preferably sort of chicken wire or any sort of iron-based material that has been zinc coated. So if you've got some plate material that has a zinc coating on, you can use, or the best is your chicken wire, because that is iron connect with zinc coating on. And so you have the two. You have your one plate as your nano copper, and your other plate is essentially your chicken wire. And what that does is it sets up the conditions to also pull in the carbon fields from the environment, and as well as the hydrogen, so that you are creating the CH3 in the bottom of your container. And this is always that red looking GANS in the middle there. Now, when you're producing the CH3 is essentially it's like a sugar for the body, but it's not actual sugar, because it's more, we look at as the sugar for the body because it provides the energy in terms of the three hydrogens. And because we're using the chicken wire, which has the iron within the material and just with the zinc coating, that then gives us an additional connection. The CH3 will have the fields of iron within it, which then also helps for us to connect to our blood and any of the animal's blood as well, because of the iron contained in our hemoglobin. So these are the four main GANSes. We have the CO2, the zinc oxide, the copper oxide, and the CH3. So these were the very first four GANSes that Mr. Kish taught us to use, to create, and to then use. Now, we need to know that each GANS will have its own uses. Each GANS will have its own magnetic gravitational field strength. Each one of those GANS materials is in giving off and receiving fields at the same time. And we can use a lot of these for our own body as well as for animals and agriculture, because it has that shame connection. We all are made of a basic amino acid structure. So when we're looking at the GANS materials for health and for our body, as we know, our body is made up of 95% of the 4 basic amino acids, components of the amino acid, which is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So when we start looking at the GANSs that we produce, each element matches with a certain field strength in the body. The carbon is the connector and the communicator. So, that connects with every cell within our body. And that's why the use of the CO2 GANS is so good from a health perspective, is because it's able to interact with every cell of our body. Oxygen, we have learned that oxygen is the gravitator. So very much like in the matter state world, when we're dealing with magnets, we know that iron acts as that role, as the magnet. So when we create an iron magnet, or this, it's the iron within the magnet which acts as that sort of gravitator role. Now, when we're talking of GANS materials in our body, oxygen plays that role. So oxygen plays the central role as that central magnet, which then allows the cells to interact with each other and link up, and it gives us that gravitational center. And then hydrogen is the energy. Now, when we're looking at very specific CO2 GANS, so we're looking, CO2 is 1 carbon, 2 oxygen. So carbon is that connection. So it's that connects, as I said, with every cell in our body, because there's carbon within the amino acid structure on every cell protein in the body. And then oxygen is the gravitator. So when we look at drinking the CO2 water, the water as we drink connects with any of the oxygen plays that role and allows it to connect with the different cells. And when we get the 2 sort of plasmas interacting, they connect and we get the flow of fields between the 2. So the CO2 reconnects with the body and emotion, and it's a general rebalance for health and pain relief. It rebalances high energy states such as viruses and cancer, or adds energy as required. So the oxygen would attach, because we've got the CO2, it would attach itself to sort of viruses or anything like that. And then the 2 plasmas interact, and we know that high energy plasma always feeds a low energy plasma. And so the 2 would interact and either reduce that energy from the virus, or it would add energy. So that is the beauty of the GANS material, is it can give energy, but it can also take energy away from the body. Incorporates carbon-14, some of the CO2 that we do produce, and that comes down to the quality of your nanocopper plates, but we do produce some of the carbon-14, which, as we've learned, has a direct connection to the soul. The CO2 can be used when you're making different patches, or if you're drinking the water off, and if you want to create all sorts of different health devices. So this is the most fundamental and important GANS for your health, and is generally the first one GANS material that one goes to when you're wanting to look at your health. And it's also the most common one used for agriculture. and it's for plants as well as for animals. Your copper oxide GANS connects with our lymph system, and the lymph system is in charge of the body processes. It also interacts with all our muscle tissues, because all our muscle contains copper, and then our nervous system. So when we're looking at we've understood how copper works in the material world, because it's a great conductor of electricity. We use it for all our electricity appliances. So it works the same in the body. When you have your copper, it allows that flow of the magnetic gravitational fields throughout your body, along the nervous system lines. Because I know in some of the workshops, Mr. Kesh was saying, only 20% of the information flows along the actual nervous system, and almost 80% of the information flows along the fields around the body. And often we find where we have blockages or problems with the muscles or the nervous system, it's because we're stopping the flow of the fields. And so using the copper GANS allows those fields to flow again, gives that body that connection. Copper is also a very good disinfection. Copper is well known as a disinfectant. People use copper surfaces. They used to, in the old days, in hospitals, have all copper surfaces. So copper itself, from a GANS point of view, and using the copper GANS water, is a great disinfectant. The CH3, when we're looking at the carbon and the hydrogen, so the carbon is that connection to the body, and then hydrogen is energy. That's what we thrive on. Everything essentially gets converted down, and it's the energy we use is hydrogen. Same as with the plants, it's the hydrogen which gives us the energy. Now the CH3 is connected to the blood and the emotion. So because of the way that CH3 is produced using the chicken wire, which contains the iron, this then allows the CH3 to connect with the blood and the hemoglobin in the blood, which is the iron. And we've then learned that the blood carries the emotion, our emotion. So when we do have a lot of emotional issues and stuff like that, CH3 works very well. It also gives us that energy. If people are lacking from energy or recovering from illnesses and need extra energy, the CH3 works very well. As I say, it's like the sugar, like the rush of, if we have too much sugar drinks, we get a rush. The CH3 works the same way. It gives us that hydrogen, that energy, that hydrogen, but without the side effects of using actual sugar. So it's used in healing and feeding, and also used in agriculture as well. Your zinc oxide, this is connected to our emotion. It sort of has a very similar field strength to our emotional field strength. And again, is one of those which should be used in all health applications, because a lot of our health issues are emotionally related, and always has that emotional connection. And the emotional is our emotional energy is much stronger than the actual physical body, and so our emotions control the body. So, when we're wanting to look at helping ourselves to heal or get over illnesses, we have to look at treating the physical body, but more importantly, one has to look at the emotional side as more important. And again, it's also used in agriculture as the zinc GANS. Now, this is just some of the sort of troubleshooting points that when you are making your GANS and things aren't working quite well, what you can do is always adjust if you set up your GANS box and you're not producing any materials, have a look at that distance between your plates, because maybe your plates might be too far apart from each other. So maybe move them a little bit closer and see whether that helps with you producing your GANS. Again, you can play around with your different salt percentages that you can use and just see which works best for your particular area. And as we said here, don't add any form of power or battery, because the minute you set up any of your boxes with that battery power, it starts, when you're looking at your CO2 box, and if you add a battery to that one, all you're going to do is produce zinc GANS, and you're not going to produce any of the CO2. So it might look like you're producing lots, but it's not of what you're really wanting. And the other thing is, one can also, if you want to confirm that you are producing CO2 GANS, put it in the freezer and see how, because the GANSes don't freeze, but one can also play with the effects. You've seen a lot of pictures. If you put GANS with a bowl of water, or put it in the freezer, one can start seeing the effects of the fields of your GANS material in the water. The other important thing when you're making any of your GANSes and when you're making your nanocopper plates is your intention when you're creating, is what you want to produce and your emotional state at the time. Because you do not want to start set up a CO2 box when you're either very angry or depressed, because our energies will be translated into the GANS that you produce. Over the years, Lisa and I have made a lot of different devices, and we will often not make anything because we're probably not in the right frame of mind. So we'll often wait a week or two, and then okay, now I'm ready to make the GANSes or make this device with the GANS materials, because your intention, your emotion is part of whatever you create. So always be aware of where you are in your mental space when you are dealing with these GANS materials. As they say, our thoughts and energy are magnetic fields, and so these can be transferred to your GANS materials, get taken in by your GANS materials. The other GANS which we have learnt over the last 2 years, as we've all experienced, was the Cup of Life number 1, and then Cup of Life number 2. So I'm sure this was a very easy one, so I'm sure all of you have sort of made your Cup of Life number 1, Cup of Life number 2. Your Cup of Life number 1, when you look at the report that came out, it contained quite a bit of CO2. It contained calcium GANS, there was zinc in there, and there was copper in there. So there was quite a wide variety of materials that were created within that cup number 1. So people have found good health benefits from it in general, and obviously it was used for the certain of the coronavirus protocols being around the world. And then cup number 2 as well. As I said, the cup number 2, which was more the copper-based one, is a great antibiotic when you use that water of cup number 2 with the salt water of your CO2 GANS water, wash water, and you mix those 10% of your CO2 salt water with your cup number 2 water, and that's sort of a great antibiotic treatment. I've used it, and several people have used it, and I found it very, very effective. So when you're looking at your different cups, and even when you're looking at your different CO2 boxes or copper boxes, Your plates, whether one uses plates or whether one uses coils, all add different interactions. You know, the plates is that sort of one mono surface. You're going to create certain of GANSes with a certain field strength. If you're going to create like a CO2 and you're going to use copper coils and like zinc coil, you will still create your CO2, but because of the complexity of the coils and the interactions between your nano layers on the coil, you're going to create a lot wider variety of field strengths of the CO2. So each one, every condition or everything you change within your boxes sets up a slightly different condition, and then you're going to attract and create GANSes with slightly different field effects. So, you know, one can always experiment and play around. You know, if you've got several boxes, you can create one box with the traditional plates, and then you create other boxes just by playing around with different combinations of plates and coils and everything else like that. And then at the end of the day, you can, the GANs you collect, you can then mix together so that the CO2 that you are creating then has such a wide field strength, and so it can connect to more, has more interaction with your body. So the amino acids for different applications, these can be added back into your GANS after washing and then used. It is a closer connection to the body because it's that amino acid structure connects directly with our amino acid structure within the body.
Okay, so here I wanted to just interject because I've been doing quite a lot of work on the aminos lately, and so I have been drying the GANS and adding it to different aminos as a sort of a cheat. And I thought anyone who's interested, yes, you do need to dry your GANSes. I've even dried aminos as well. And then if you need them to be dry, if you're going to be adding them to any oils, because obviously all oils, whether they're cooking oils or herbal oils, anything like that, are essentially amino acid structures. So if we add a dry GANS to something like a comfrey oil, comfrey in itself is already a very healing plant, and you've created a infusion with the comfrey oil. If you add the dry GANS to this, it will make a souped up version, potentized version of your comfrey oil, which really, really connects to the body. And literally, if we were in Northern Rivers today and we were at our workshop, I had a whole lot of very interactive things set up, and one could go and feel a whole lot of things. And so if you need it and you hold that bottle of the comfrey oil with the GANS in, it immediately, you can feel it. It's very, very potent and very strong. I did one with vitamin E oil, vitamin D oil as well. And that was just in the middle of winter when I hadn't been out in the sun much. And my heavens, it gave me a kick when I felt that oil after giving it a good shake with some dried GANS. But be warned, it must be dried, because if you put anything wet in with the oils can turn rancid. So it needs to be dry GANS. So there's a little tip and trick, and the amino acids, as I say, are even more connected to the body than the plain GANS itself. So you can really get interesting results if you play with certain oils and GANSes combined, and also if you dry some of the actual aminos. And all you're needing to put into, let's say, a little bottle of vitamin D oil is literally a tip of a knife of the dry GANS. You don't need very much to do it. So there's some fun things for you to try and test at home.
Any questions? No questions.
Everyone's fallen asleep.
Well, that brings us to the end. So I think there are some. Okay. Nothing in the chat. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Will you be talking about the energy ones? Energy machines, or make reference to where we can find it?
The new systems that are the new systems that are out. Is that what you?
Yes, please. Yeah, please. Or just tell us, somebody saw it on your website.
Yes.
Is that right?
Well, what's happening now is that the you would call the prototypes have been released. Mr. Kesh has shown them in action, and they're busy working on the manufacture side of it to start manufacturing within the next couple of months. So the one is an energy unit, which is it's either a 5 or 10 kilowatt system, which is a generator itself. The other one is a gas unit, which creates either methane or CO2, which can then generate gas on demand. And then we also have a new and improved MagRav style unit, which is one that can be hooked up into the house, which already has the power grid. So these are all in the offing for the end of the year. They are at the moment on the Kesh store for pre-release order. Although a lot of people that I've spoken to have said they're going to wait to see them launched before they order them. But yes, this can help, especially with hopefully this is now something that can be pushed forward because of the whole problem with the gas in Europe, and they are creating them in Austria. Hopefully they're allowed to come out without too much problems in terms of trying to shut them down as per usual, any new devices that come out. So hopefully they're desperate enough that they allow everything to come out easily and freely. So those are the different devices that are currently in prototype and ready to go. The other thing is that at the moment there's a lot of testing with what you can call a flight unit, but they're not quite in flight yet. So the enhancement units have been set up to a point where in the next few weeks they're taking people who are prepared to be moved from one system to another. So they will basically sit in one system and then be transmuted to the other system, as Mr. Kesh says, with their soul encapsulate. They're going to use the soul to encapsulate the body and move a person across. So that's the first sort of workings as to where the point that they can actually move people. You can call it almost like a beam them up Scotty. So he is at the moment not releasing any devices that can move a physical object like you could call a flying saucer, because that apparently you need atomic energy for. So they haven't given him permission to use any, so he's not taking any chances. So he's using this other method, which is basically a shifting. They create an energy which allows the soul to be released from the center of the brain, and it becomes bigger. So it encapsulates the body, and then your soul decides where you want to go and you move the body with it. So that is where they are on the enhancement units. Hopefully by the end of the year, then they'll be able to shift somebody literally from Australia to Austria, for example, and back again once they've done all these tests. So it's a slowly forward approach to all this testing. the testing in the last little while has all been about, you know, what people see and feel and how they connect to one another. And all these small little things create the necessity for them to adjust and adjust until they get further along the cycle to where they can actually move people, animals, or plants from one location to another. So those are all the very basic what's going on in the Keshe Foundation at the moment. It's all quite difficult for a lot of people because it sounds extremely weird and far-fetched. But if you understand the science behind it, it makes sense. But it's still going to be a while before people will actually accept this technology, because it needs to be shown. Yeah, even if you show somebody moving from one side of the room to another, they'll say, oh, it was a trick with a camera. So I don't know if anybody else has any other questions on those.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Irene.
I know we're all a bit deflated today because of Neil, and so not quite up to the good fine chat. So yeah.
Are we happy to call it a day?
Yes,
Yep.
I think
Good.
so.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really good. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Lisa and Jimmy.
No
We
problems.
missed you.
Yes. I'm getting better, so next time we'll be able to come.
Wonderful. Yeah, we'll just start video.
All right. Okay.
Okay. See ya.
Thanks very
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Thank you.
Keep well.
Thank you
Thanks,
for doing
Jim.
it. Bye.
Thanks,
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.